In this demonstration, you'll learn how Measure Factory processes rules and measures. Let's start by looking at the types of data you can submit to Measure Factory for processing. Measure Factory can work with two types of data: transactional data and referential data. Transactional data is data that documents an event. In a hospital setting, the event might be the admission of a patient, and the transactional data recorded for that event could include the patient's name, the date the patient was admitted, insurance information, and so on. The transactional data can be captured by your organization in a variety of different formats, but then undergoes the extract, transform, and load process to become a CBase that you can work with in ProDiver and process further with Measure Factory. Referential data, also called reference data, is data that provides definitions for codes used in a database. For example, a hospital charges database might include revenue codes that identify the types of services rendered to each patient. In our example, the code 110 signifies a room and board charge, while the code 170 indicates a nursery charge. These codes and their definitions are stored in text files, making it easier to change and update them should it become necessary. And this reference data, like transactional data, can also be used as inputs for the Measure Factory process. Now that we know what types of inputs Measure Factory can accept, let's look at what happens inside Measure Factory. In Measure Factory, we create a configuration file. The configuration file specifies all the datasets we want to work with, including both transactional datasets and reference datasets, and all the rules and measures we want to apply to those datasets. Next, we run the configuration file. Running the configuration file generates one or more transformed datasets. It also generates metadata, including measure descriptions and definitions, and underlying data such as markers, C-plans, and dive plans. Let's look at the transformed dataset more closely. A transformed dataset contains these three things: all the transactional data from the original dataset, reference data, if the configuration file was set up to pull reference data into the dataset, and all the rules you created for that dataset and their resulting values. Notice that the transformed dataset does not contain measure data at this point. Measures are associated with a time frame that can change on a daily basis. For example, a month-to-date calculation performed on June 18th will differ from a month-to-date calculation performed on June 19th. For this reason, measures are not evaluated until you interact with the transformed dataset in ProDiver. So now we have our transformed dataset. Using the transformed dataset, we can then create a measure on a dashboard. Dashboard measures, like the measures in a transformed dataset in ProDiver, are not evaluated until you interact with them. Let's go back to the configuration file to look at one more important piece of information about the way Measure Factory processes data. When you create rules in the configuration file, you can create them in any order you'd like. As long as the rules are properly defined, Measure Factory will figure out not only what order to process them in, but find the most efficient way to process them. This is why we call Measure Factory an automated rules engine. You can devote your energies to constructing the rules themselves and let Measure Factory figure out the best way to apply them. So that's the Measure Factory process. You identify your data inputs, create a configuration file that specifies the data inputs, rules, and measures you want to use, run the configuration file, and either analyze the output in ProDiver or use it to create a dashboard element on a DivePort page.